Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and what has been a pretty busy week for all of us here. And next week will be even busier. But to end this week, we have a cracking show for you. Dilip Amin is here to talk about the Battle of Britain bunker and the world's first integrated air defense system. Links to Enemy Sighted, his book about this, are in the description below, including a link to Dilip's own website, where if you want to, you can purchase a signed copy directly from him. If you're new to the channel, a few new people over the last few days, the description below is where you'll find all the details you'll need, not only my guests' websites and their books, but also World War II TV information like merchandise and things like that. But without further ado, I'll bring Dilip in. Good evening, sir. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, Paul. Thank you.
So the Battle of Britain bunker, I happened to go there myself in September for the first time in 25 years. And, I understand that it's a lot of volunteers there. You were in the police for a long time, detective work. How did you end up volunteering at the Battle of Britain bunker, and why did you want to set about telling the story of this integrated air defense system?
Sure, thank you. Well, the Battle of Britain bunker, for anyone who's been and anyone who's yet to go, is just a fascinating place, and it played such a pivotal role in world history. So a few years ago, 7 years ago, I was unfortunate enough to have several heart attacks. And as most people do afterwards, they think about all the things that they should get round to doing. And one of them was to go to the underground bunker at Uxbridge. I managed to go there. And when I stood in front of the table and the map that the Battle of Britain was actually fought and won on, it was for me a defining moment, Paul. And I thought, I really want to learn even more. So I offered my services as a volunteer, and now I have the great privilege of going there, as I am tomorrow, to share these fascinating stories with people.
Yeah, and as we were talking when we did our pre-chat a few days ago, when I was there in September with John McManus, and John, writes about history and has been and teaches about history. We're the kind of people that don't really like to boil it down to turning points, because usually turning points in World War II aren't quite the single turning point that we kind of legend has them to be. But as you'll be talking about today, there are some points in 1940 where there are these pivotal moments where it is, the fate of the free world, in a sense, is hanging, it's on a knife edge there. Mm-hmm. And this system was absolutely integral to that there. And that's what we're going to be talking about right now. So I'll bring up your PowerPoint, and Dilip is in charge of progressing it today. Please, folks, fire away with your questions as we go along. I think a lot of your questions will be kind of answered as we go along, but as always, we'll handle them as we go along. So over to you, Dilip, to take us through this.
Thank you. Okay, look, so I'd like to share with you my book, Enemy Sighted. It's the first in a trilogy following Fighter Command, in particular 11 Group, as it prepared for and fought its way through the Second World War. It's a story of how Britain developed the world's first integrated air defense system and how it was skillfully wielded to thwart invasion, and it was all about invasion, over 80 years ago, saving not only the Royal Air Force, not only Great Britain, but indeed saving the free world. And fundamental to its telling is the 11 Group Operations Room at Uxbridge, commonly referred to as the Battle of Britain bunker. And it's difficult to overstate just how important the bunker's role was in frustrating the Nazis' obsession of creating a Third Reich and their appetite for world domination. Without the people who worked deep below Royal Air Force Uxbridge and those who worked across Britain's integrated air defense system, Fighter Command's pilots could not have routed the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain, and so would have been unable to prevent Operation Seelöwe, the planned invasion of the British Isles. And who better than Winston Churchill to state just how important the integrated air defense system was to victory in the Battle of Britain. Churchill said, "All the ascendancy of the Hurricanes and Spitfires would have been fruitless, but for the system which had been delivered and built before the war. It had been shaped and refined in constant action, and all was now fused together into a most elaborate instrument of war, the like of which existed nowhere in the world." This is such recent history. What happened then is directly affecting us today. And many of the lessons learned there are directly relevant in today's conflict-ridden world, especially the perils and consequences of failing to stand up to state aggression. Now, I knew about plenty of books on the Battle of Britain and plenty that talked about Spitfires, Hurricanes, and radar, but I wasn't aware of any which talked about Britain's integrated air defence system as a whole, set against a backcloth of turmoil on a colossal scale, with the Battle of Britain bunker at its heart. I decided to write that book. Its name came quite easily to me. It had to be associated with the story I would tell. It had to excite. It had to capture the imagination. It was going to be called Enemy Sighted. Those were the words above the red lights that would light up in the bunker when the old English hunting cry, "Tally ho!" was heard in the bunker, announcing that the enemy had been seen and was being engaged. I discovered that the skills I'd acquired in the police and the experience I'd gained and the opportunities I had whilst researching the stories behind incidents and events while developing personal presentational skills would all prove to be invaluable to me as a military historian and author. And I must say, I really enjoy and I'm really passionate about researching, as well as conducting countless internet searches and reading countless books and reports. I have undertaken numerous visits to the reading rooms at the Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon and the National Archives at Kew. I was there yesterday researching for the next installment in the trilogy, Enemy Engaged. Now, handling confidential wartime documents marked most secret and top secret is thrilling. Reading the actual combat reports written by pilots giving first-hand accounts of aerial combat is electrifying. I feel like I have the good fortune to travel back in time, and being a time traveler allows me the privilege of writing about what I have discovered. Much of it is a revelation to the reader. Enemy Sighted has over 300 citations. My publisher told me it has a lot of "Hey Doris" moments. I said, "What's a Hey Doris moment?" He said, "It's when you found out something and you can't wait to share it with someone and you say, 'Hey Doris, did you know that?' Such and such." Now, I wanted my book to be an interesting read that told a story from lots of different perspectives. I didn't want it to be mechanistic, just explaining what lots of different bits did. The integrated air defense system didn't operate as an aside or outside the fighting that took place. It was embedded, integral to what happened during that epoch period in history, on the ground and in the air. I wanted to weave facts, threats, decisions, actions, and outcomes together and present it in a way that would transport people reading my book back in time, back to the battle for France, back to the evacuation from Dunkirk, and back through the perilous days of the Battle of Britain, when all that stood in the way of a Nazi invasion was fighter command. I wanted it to be a broad historical account with lots of information, again, told from lots of different perspectives. So one moment you are sat beside Winston Churchill in the 11 Group operations room, 60 feet below ground to the west of London, and next you are bailing out of a burning hurricane 15,000 feet over Kent. Enemy Sighted has over 200 pages of information. But what I'd like to do now is give you a flavour.
And just to interrupt you for a second, fantastic start of the show there, Dilip, is that there are some people watching this who are big radar fans. They understand how it works, they understand all the technical side of it, and of course it's important to understand that to a certain extent. But in my previous kind of readings about radar, it's gone a little bit dull. I found it a little bit, yeah, okay, it's just like I need to have a physics degree to understand it. And as you have made it patently clear and will do in the full presentation, at its heart, it's about people and a system working together. And the technology is part of that, but it's not necessarily the most important part. It's about how you then use this technology, and people can get to grips with it. So thanks for making it nice and exciting, and not just talking about, you know, megahertz and cycles and wave peaks and all that kind of stuff.
In the book, those readers will find plenty about that, but absolutely, it's much more about the holistic story, about not Churchill's few, but Churchill's many that came together to save Britain in its hour of need. Okay, thank you. So, to understand the story of Britain's defence and the part the bunker played during the Battle of Britain, first we need to travel back, way back in time, to when these islands were repeatedly invaded, sometimes by large armies and other times by much smaller groups of marauders. And regardless of whether the invasions were successful or not, they all shared one thing in common: the invaders needed ships to cross the water to reach Britain, and the defenders also needed ships to repel the invasion force before it reached land. The sea was a natural barrier. Britain was an island, and Britannia did indeed rule the waves. All this changed on the 25th of July 1909, when Louis Blériot crossed the English Channel, and that's a picture of him with the white cliffs of Dover in the background, in a flimsy aeroplane held together astonishingly with piano wire. Blériot's plane flew for just 25 miles or 40 kilometers. Geographically, the journey was small, but historically, it was huge. It was worthy of Neil Armstrong's famous words when he flew to the moon just 60 years later. It was indeed one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Blériot's flight demonstrated man's ability to use machines to travel through the air. It demonstrated that Britain could now be reached more rapidly and less conspicuously. The sea was no longer an absolute barrier. Britain was no longer an island. The threat had changed, and Britain's response had to change too. The Royal Navy could not, on its own, be expected to guard against future incursions. Aircraft approaching Britain would be flying within a vast three-dimensional domain, making the task of detecting and intercepting them more difficult than had been the case with ships. This is because only knowledge of two dimensions, both existing on a horizontal plane, is required to detect and intercept ships. The first, as you can see, is the direction that they are approaching from, the azimuth angle on the horizon. And the second is their distance from the defending forces. Aircraft travel along these two dimensions, plus an additional third dimension on a vertical plane that we know as height. If their height is unknown, then they can hide in miles of sky and cannot be successfully intercepted. A further and more obvious challenge in the case of aircraft is a significantly reduced period in which to detect and intercept them. This is because they are traveling much faster than ships, and unlike ships, they don't stop on reaching the coast, but instead continue their journey inland at speed. The challenge was to create a system capable of detecting approaching enemy aircraft early enough to alert ground forces and get fighter aircraft not only into the air, but able to be at the right place and at the right height to stop the enemy before they reach their targets. Now, that threat soon became reality when German airships and bombers raided Britain during the First World War. The arrangements for defending Britain against attacks from the air proved to be woefully inadequate. During 3 raids in 1917, out of the 120 fighters sent up, only 1 was able to find and attack the enemy. The solution to effectively protect Britain against aerial attack when Britain went to war with Germany for a second time would be neither straightforward nor immediate. Britain's integrated air defence system would be forged from 6 essential elements: In Enemy Sighted, I describe Fighter Command's aerial shield using the analogy of a spider spinning a web of interconnected signal and capture threads to catch a fly. The sticky threads, radiating from the center of a web, are called capture threads. Their job is to catch a fly when it comes in contact with a web. The capture threads within the integrated air defense system were Fighter Command's interceptor aircraft, anti-aircraft gun batteries, and balloon barrages. Their role was to make contact with and overwhelm the enemy. Now, some spiders hide and lie in wait in a spider hole, using signal threads to transmit vibrational sensory information. Here, the air defense system's signal threads were its radar stations, the observer core, and searchlights, which collectively help betray the enemy's presence. The spider hole, by the way, was the underground operations room at Uxbridge. It was from here that the spider was dispatched across the southeast of England. And the arrangement of dedicated teleprinter and telephone networks which had been established across the entire system were, continue the spider's web analogy, the silk that held the web together. The efficacy of the system, like success in the Battle of Britain, which it helped to win, was not in reality down to a few, but rather the many. However, I'd like to first tell you about two key individuals in this story. The first is Hugh Tremenhere Caswell Dowding, who significantly in 1930 was appointed by the Air Ministry to lead on development and research. He would help build Britain's integrated air defense system. It would be the first of its kind, and it would go on to save the free world. The system is, for this reason, also referred to as the Dowding system. And fortunately for us, Dowding's next appointment was as head of Fighter Command at Stanmore in North London. Who better to deploy Britain's integrated air defense system when the country went to war than the person who perhaps understood it best? The second key individual is Keith Rodney Park, whose contribution, like Dowding's, was essential in the telling of this story. Park, a New Zealander, had been Dowding's senior staff officer while the system was being developed. He was then appointed to lead 11 Group, which he did magnificently during the Battle of Britain from his headquarters at Uxbridge in West London. This is the large statue of him now displayed outside the bunker. Before being moved there, it was displayed on the fourth plinth of Nelson's column at Trafalgar Square, and quite rightly so, because Park and his contribution to victory in the Battle of Britain stands alongside those other great national heroes whose battles would go on to shape world history: Nelson at Trafalgar and Wellington at Waterloo. Now, of course, he wasn't really that tall, but metaphorically, he was huge. German intelligence, when developing profiles of all Allied leaders in 1944, dubbed him the Defender of London. Clearly, the enemy thought he had done a good job, perhaps too good, in keeping them out of Britain 4 years earlier. Let's now look at the essential elements within Britain's integrated air defense system. They were interdependent, working in unison to give everyone, everywhere, the same recognized air picture over Britain, much as interconnected computers do today, except in 1939-1940, as we all know, there was no such thing as a computer or internet, which makes the integrated air defense system the first of its kind anywhere in the world all the more amazing. First were Fighter Command's two main day fighters, the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire. During the Battle of Britain, roughly 2/3 were Hawker Hurricanes, and the majority of the remaining third were Supermarine Spitfires. And if we were to look at them in equestrian terms, then the Hawker Hurricane is very much our sturdy, reliable workhorse, doing much of the heavy lifting and work. And the Supermarine Spitfire, Well, that's our thoroughbred racehorse. And in the summer of 1940, they complemented each other magnificently as they repelled the Luftwaffe's fusillade over southern England. Next was Fighter Command itself. Its headquarters at Stanmore, also called Bentley Priory, which was where Dowding was based. The operations room here, supplied with information on hostile raids by the filter room here, had oversight of the recognized air picture over the whole of the British Isles. And it's from here that the business of air defense was coordinated across a patchwork of groups, which in turn controlled a myriad of sectors and satellite airfields. There were 4 groups covering the United Kingdom. This is the actual map, by the way, in the underground operations room at Uxbridge. And you can see it shows the southern part of England, and then to the right, parts of occupied Northwest Europe with the English Channel separating them. You can see dark blue lines in southern England. To the bottom left-hand side would have been number 10 group, guarding southwest England and South Wales. Then to the right, where all the blocks are, was 11 group at Uxbridge, which was responsible for operations over occupied Northwest Europe, Southeast England, the approaches to London, and the capital itself. What Churchill, in his descriptive language, described as a valuable prize cow tethered for the beast of prey. And in the summer of 1940, London was the world's largest, most populous city, and it was the job of the bunker at Uxbridge to defend it. Then there was 12 Group, which covered East Anglia and the Industrial Midlands, and finally 13 Group, which covered Northern England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Now, 11 Group had 7 sectors, all iconic Battle of Britain names: Tangmere, North Weald, Hornchurch, Kenley, Biggin Hill, Debden, and Northolt. The senior controller at Uxbridge would issue orders on the telephone to the sector controller as to which squadrons should engage which hostile raid. The sector controller at the relevant sector would use the radio to talk to the formation leaders in the air, vectoring them to where they needed to be. And the formation leader in the air would determine how the enemy was to be engaged. Next, there was radio detection and ranging, what we know as radar. It was the key to unlocking the interception puzzle. It was, in today's parlance, a game changer, providing Britain's aerial defence with much needed time to scramble and reach fighting height before engaging the enemy. Because if you were higher than the enemy and you could see them first, and you could convert your height into speed as you dive down on them, all vital for dogfighting. Once radar detected aircraft over northwest France, they could be over London within 20 minutes. The radar station would send information to the filter room at Bentley Priory, which we saw earlier, who would then assign a unique raid number, for example, raid hostile 10, and forward it to the senior controller at Uxbridge in around 4 minutes. 20 take away 4 leaves us 16 minutes. A squadron of Spitfires, after they have been scrambled, would take around 13 minutes to reach an operating altitude of around 20,000 feet. 16 take away 13 leaves us 3 minutes. And Hurricanes, being somewhat slower, would take around 16 minutes to reach an operating altitude of 20,000 feet. 16 take away 16 would run out of time. And it was all about time. The British built a number of chain-home radar stations, predominantly along the eastern and the southern coastline of the British Isles. They looked like electricity pylons, and they worked like floodlights, lighting up an area with radio signals up to 100 miles in front of them. But chain-home couldn't see low-flying raiders. The chain-home mast, by the way, the first ones, could see German aircraft after they had taken off from captured airfields in northwest France, giving Fighter Command precious moments in which to launch its reprisal. But as I say, chain home stations, these ones that you can see now, couldn't see low-flying raiders. So the British developed chain home low stations. The range was now no longer 100 miles. It was more akin to 20 or 30 miles. But chain home low could detect aircraft flying as low as 500 feet. What both chain home and chain home low couldn't do is rotate. So they couldn't follow hostile raids after they had flown overhead. This is where the next part of the integrated air defense system came in. The Observer Corps, later called the Royal Observer Corps because of what they'd achieved during the Battle of Britain. 3,000 volunteers every 5 to 8 miles along the British coastline, as well as in towns and cities across Britain, always surrounded by sandbags, perhaps a hole in the ground, perhaps on top of a large building in London. They were relied on to pick up Raid Hostile 1-0 and continue tracking its course inland. Then there were anti-aircraft guns and searchlights, a large number of guns to down German raiders. But even if they didn't, they forced the raiders to fly much higher, and therefore their bombing, it was hoped, would be less precise and less accurate. And they no doubt served to boost morale amongst the British public, who at that moment in time would be seeking shelter. The fact that they could hear somebody firing back would be very positive. And finally, Balloon Command. Large hydrogen balloons tethered to steel cables over key strategic locations. Great if enemy aircraft crashed into them. Unfortunately, the figures show by the end of the war, more British aircraft had collided with them than German aircraft, simply because there were more British aircraft flying around the clock. Britain, however, what the balloons did do is make the raiders fly much higher, and therefore their bombing hopefully would be less precise and less accurate. So those are the elements which formed the world's first integrated air defense system. Let me now take you back in time to September 1938. The then British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain visited Munich in Germany on 3 separate occasions to meet with Herr Hitler and Signor Mussolini, hoping to avert a war which people thought may not be stoppable. This shows Pathé newsreel Chamberlain returning to Britain and landing at Heston Airfield in West London. Chamberlain is waving and holding a piece of paper with Herr Hitler's signature. Later that evening, outside number 10 Downing Street, Chamberlain speaks of peace in our time. Unfortunately, that wasn't to be the case. The order had already gone out that all above-ground operations rooms should now be relocated below ground. This is the underground operations room at Uxbridge. The construction of the underground bunker was carried out in top secret by Sir Robert McAlpine's company, who to this day dig up our towns and cities and generally inconvenience us. But certainly in the lead up to war, they did a cracking job. In 1938, they dug a hole 60 feet or 18 meters deep. And then between February and August the following year, they constructed a 2-story underground structure. Amazingly, in just 7 months. And amazingly, it was fully operational just 9 days before the declaration of war. 7 months. You couldn't get planning permission in 7 months now, could you, Paul?
And just to jump in, Dilip, I think we're all burdened a little bit with this myth that Little Britain was completely blindsided by the declaration of war and the blitzkrieg and attacking the attacks on Poland, and that we had no preparations and everything was, made up the next day. And reminding us that actually, even from the 30s onwards, there is a realization that there is a potential threat of war on the horizon. Things are hotting up, and Spanish Civil War. So thanks for kind of just reminding us that that the Dad's Army idea of Britain being suddenly thrust into war with no expectation, no realization, having to plan everything after the event, it's patently nonsense. All of that. There are lots of work had been done in advance.
Absolutely, Paul. And just whilst we were talking about Chamberlain then, it's true that Chamberlain's visits to Munich didn't buy peace. But what it did do, and I mentioned in my book, is that it bought time. Precious time for fighter command to position itself for the assaults that would be happening. So had that time not been bought, then Britain would have been in a more perilous state.
Yeah.
Okay. The bunker, and this is the view from the senior controller's gallery in the underground operations room. It operated around the clock to defend Britain. There were 4 teams, or watches as they were called, of 70 people each. And interestingly and importantly, 80% of those staff were actually women, predominantly from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. Now, even though social wisdom, or should I say lack of wisdom at the time, said that women couldn't perform the demanding roles of plotters and tellers and others in the bunker, the women would prove that they were more than up to the task. And indeed, they would prove themselves to be amongst the unsung heroes of the Battle of Britain. The setup that you see here was all for the senior controller, who sat behind the center of the curved glass gallery and looked down at the computer desk and his computer screen to make life and death decisions, not only life and death for the pilots in the Spitfires and Hurricanes, but also life and death for the nation itself. It was said that Park and his senior controllers could lose the war hour by hour, not the battle, the war. The information displayed on the wall showed the status of 11 groups aircraft, balloons, and even the prevailing weather. It was as if the senior controller sat 60 feet below ground to the west of London, could metaphorically open a window, look out and see what was happening on the Kent, Sussex, Essex and Hampshire coastline. How brilliant, how ahead of its time was this integrated air defense system. We know that Neville Chamberlain visited Munich in Germany in September 1938. Fast forward 12 months, September 1939, Britain is at war with Nazi Germany. She sends the majority of her professional army, the British Expeditionary Force, along with most of its heavy equipment, across the Channel to aid her ally, France. Hurricane squadrons operating from French airfields, and that's one there, are embedded within the British Expeditionary Force. And a further 3 squadrons of Hurricanes are sent daily across the Channel by the senior controller at Uxbridge. The British Expeditionary Force, along with components of the French army, make their way north to the Franco-Belgian border, where they wait. They think it's going to be a repeat of the First World War. They think the Germans will move south into the Belgium and the French and British will move north to meet them. They think the Germans can't enter France from its eastern border because of the heavily fortified Maginot Line, a system of tunnels, forts and gun emplacements. And between the Maginot Line and where the French and British armies are waiting was the heavily wooded area known as the Forest of Ardennes, which the Allies think is impenetrable to mechanized armor. By April 1940, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Norway, Denmark are all under Nazi control. Then, on the 10th of May, Britain has a new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. He is belligerent, and under his leadership, there will be no acquiescence to Nazi aggression. And on the same day, the Germans launch Operation Seelöwe, their blitzkrieg against the countries of Western Europe. They enter Belgium from the north. The British and the French enter from the south to resist them. But a reconnaissance Spitfire under the direction and control of Uxbridge spots German mechanized divisions moving rapidly through the forest of Ardennes. Soon the French and the British armies are at risk of being surrounded and annihilated. Soon there is only one course of action left, and that is to retreat. But where to? They decide to retreat to the northern French port of Dunkirk. Between the 26th of May and the 4th of June, the British, under Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, launch an audacious plan, Operation Dynamo. They hope to rescue up to 30,000 troops from Dunkirk. Daily, the senior controller at Uxbridge dispatches 16 squadrons of Bolton-Paul Defiants, Hurricanes and Spitfires to support the troops making their way to Dunkirk, to support the troops waiting in orderly columns on the beaches at Dunkirk, and to protect the ships that have been sent to rescue them. Unfortunately, the British Army do not see much of the Royal Air Force, and they cruelly dub it the Royal Absent Force, but nothing could have been further from the truth. The British fighters are being sent much higher, much further inland to engage the Luftwaffe formation, stopping the majority of them ever reaching the beaches at Dunkirk. Now, in the end, the British do not rescue 30,000 troops from Dunkirk. They rescue 386,000 troops, but the evacuation is not yet complete. On the 18th of June, Winston Churchill gives a forthcoming battle over southern England a name, and he gives one of his inspirational speeches to shore up the free world. Churchill says, "What General Wagon has called the Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, then all Europe may be freed and the life of the world move forward into broad sunlit uplands. But if he fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say that this was their finest hour." The evacuations continue, and by the 25th of June, a further 206,000 troops are saved. Over 500,000 men have now been rescued. Britain has not been knocked out of the war, but she is severely weakened.
I hate to be the one to interrupt you now, Dilip, but I just feel I want to say something there because your performance is magisterial. You're top of the tree of Churchill impersonators on the channels to date. But when you have people go to the bunker and take your tours there, obviously some go there with absolutely no knowledge about the Second World War at all. Others go there knowing, all the marks of Spitfire and everything in between that. But do you find that people who do know a bit about the war have kind of overlooked the fact that the bunker there at Uxbridge was being used in that over France stage of the battle, and that when they do think of it, they think about it purely in the when the Luftwaffe come over to England phase, and they forget it was already being used before that. Is that a common misunderstanding?
Absolutely, Paul. And I take great pleasure in talking about Dunkirk. And so when I talk to them about Fighter Command and Uxbridge's role during the evacuation from Dunkirk, I take great step to actually point out on the map to several patches behind Dunkirk which are worn, because that was the map on the table during Operation Dynamo as well. And one can imagine the amount of times the ladies with their wooden style croupier rakes would have pushed the wooden blocks repeatedly behind Dunkirk to where the Germans were and where the British needed to be too. So absolutely, it's a great revelation. And thus my point that this place was absolutely pivotal to world history.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So we've said that 500,000 men have been rescued. Britain has not been knocked out of the war, but she is severely weakened, having left much of her heavy equipment behind in France. Planes, tanks, guns, lorries, communication, ammunition, all left behind in France. Britain is in a perilous state. The Royal Air Force has lost 1,000 aircraft in the fight for France. 463 of them are fighters. It has lost 330 pilots. 280 of them are fighter pilots who will be sorely missed in the battle that will soon take place over Britain itself. This is Flying Officer Peter Cazeneu's Spitfire, brought down over Dunkirk. He survives, but stumbles across the burnt wreckage of another Spitfire on the same beach. Inside are the mortal remains of his friend, Pilot Officer Pat Learmond, shot down and killed the day before. Kazanov is taken prisoner and incarcerated in Stalag Luft 3, where he is reunited with his commanding officer, Roger Bushell, who, like Learmond, had also been shot down over Dunkirk the day before Kazanov. While in Stalag Luft 3, Kazanov helped prepare forgeries for a mass breakout by Allied prisoners of war, an event which Hollywood would later re-immortalize as The Great Escape. Due to his large build, Kazanov does not join those in the tunnel, unlike his friend Roger Bushell, who is known by others as Big X, involved in the mass breakout. He is the mastermind behind The Great Escape, and he is one of the 50 escapees who will be caught and murdered by the Gestapo. Now, returning to the battle for France, in the 6 weeks of Blitzkrieg, the Germans have attacked, conquered, occupied Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and France. Britain now stands in isolation, in anticipation of the aerial battle that will soon take place and the subsequent invasion if it were lost. Britain has less than 700 day fighters to protect the entire British Isles. The Germans have over 2,500 aircraft they can now throw into the fray. The Battle of Britain will last 4 months, starting officially on the 10th of July 1940 and ending on the 31st of October. But of course, it wasn't as clear-cut as that. On the 10th of July, the Germans launch Kanalkampf, Channel Battle. Luftwaffe aircraft attack a British convoy, codenamed Bread, which is sailing through the Straits of Dover. The senior controller at Uxbridge scrambles 173 fighters throughout the day to protect the convoy. The truth is, the Germans are not too bothered about sinking the ships themselves. They have too much higher aims. First, deny the British the use of the Channel and the Channel ports, and so pave the way for invasion. And second, entice Fighter Command into the air and into a battle of attrition, which they think numerically the British cannot hope to win. But it's not going to be a shortage of aircraft that's Fighter Command's Achilles heel. Under Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister for Aircraft Production, the British will replace lost Hurricanes and Spitfires faster than the Germans are able to replace their lost Messerschmitt 109s. It will be a shortage of experienced pilots. Of an establishment of 1,000 pilots across Fighter Command, in the first month of 4 months fighting during the battle, Fighter Command lose 74 pilots killed or missing and 48 wounded or injured. That's over 12% of its establishment. Now, new pilots are coming through, but that's the problem. They are new pilots. They are inexperienced. After you learn to fly, then to fly a Spitfire or Hurricane in an operational setting, pilots are sent on operational conversion training, which was 6 weeks, and it is reduced, and it is reduced, and it is reduced again, and some get very little indeed. 19-year-old Sergeant Pilot Tony Pickering, being posted to fly Hurricanes with 32 Squadron at RAF Biggin Hill, would recount after the war on his first day, the commanding officer asking, "Pickering, how many hours on Hurries?" Pickering retorts, "I've never seen one or sat in one, sir, and I've never fired a gun." Pickering is waiting to meet the Luftwaffe the following morning. He's one of the fortunate few that survives his first encounters, downs 5 German aircraft, is awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Many of his compatriots will not be as fortunate. Then, on the 16th of July, Adolf Hitler issues Führer Directive 16. He says, as England, in spite of a hopeless military situation, still shows no signs of coming to an arrangement, I desire to prepare and, if necessary, to carry out a landing operation against her. The objective of the operation is to eliminate the English homeland as the base from which to prosecute the war against Germany. The English Air Force must be so destroyed morally and physically, it is not able to launch any significant attack against the German crossing. It's all about invasion. On the 12th of August, the Germans attacked radar stations across southern England, knocking many off the air up to 4 hours and totally destroying the one at Ventnor on the Isle of Wight. The British immediately put up some temporary radar equipment at Ventnor. German signals intelligence, picking up the radio signals from the temporary equipment, reached the wrong conclusion that they were unsuccessful in knocking out British radar stations. They now make a catastrophic blunder. They decide to no longer seriously attack radar. The following day, just on the radar, I must say that had they carried on attacking radar stations seriously, had they knocked out Britain's all-seeing eye, fighter command would not have known when and where the Germans are coming, interception would not have taken place, the Battle of Britain would have been lost, invasion would follow. Britain was in a perilous state. The following day, the 13th of August, Adlertag, Eagle Day, the Luftwaffe starts seriously attacking 11 Group sector airfields. The plan is to drive 11 Group from the southeast of England. Oops, sorry. There you go. Back on track. The plan is to drive 11 Group from the southeast of England in 4 days and destroy fighter command across the United Kingdom in 4 weeks. After all, that's what the German war machine had done to the Poles, the Belgians, the Dutch, and the French. Why not the British as well? The attacks continue almost daily, making operating from fighter commands, precious airfields, more and more difficult as they are repeatedly bombed. Pilots are becoming exhausted. They are being scrambled up to 6 times a day. Fighter command is on its knees. Then, something happens on the night of the 24th of August, which changes the course of the battle and indeed the war. Adolf Hitler had reserved to himself the right to order reprisal attacks against London. But Luftwaffe bombers attacking industrial targets off the Thames estuary accidentally dropped some bombs on London. Winston Churchill immediately orders Bomber Command to retaliate and bomb the German capital, Berlin. Adolf Hitler becomes infuriated and orders the Luftwaffe to stop attacking 11 Group's precious airfields and instead attack Churchill's valuable prize cow, London. As a result, on the 7th of September, 950 German aircraft attack London and so start the Blitz. But they have made a catastrophic blunder. It's as though they'd had their foot on Fighter Command's throat, and they chose to lift it and allowed Fighter Command to stand up, to dust itself down and prepare, arguably, for the most decisive phase of the battle. Which brings us to the morning of Sunday the 15th of September, the day that would see the battle turn decisively in the favour of Fighter Command and was recognised then and is celebrated still as Battle of Britain Day. Now, flawed intelligence and arrogance have led the Germans to believe that no more than 100 to 300, couldn't agree, Spitfires remained to cover British Isles, the entire British Isles. No mention of Hurricanes. Luftwaffe aircrew had been told this is the last raid before invasion. The truth is, they will be met by more Hurricanes and Spitfires today than on any previous day of the battle. Churchill visits the battle of bunker on this day. And he writes about it in his wartime memoirs. It is his wife Clementine's birthday, and she tells Winston that a good bag of German bombers would make an excellent present. They're driven from their country residence at Chequers, arriving at the bunker around 10:30 in the morning, and are shown downstairs by our tall New Zealander, Keith Park. Churchill is reminded that the bunker's air ventilation unit cannot tolerate cigar or cigarette smoke, and so he sits acquiescently with an unlit cigar between his teeth, behind the curved glass gallery, from where, like the Greek gods on Mount Olympus, he will watch the burgeoning threat unfold and the counter-offensive rise into the sky. By 11 o'clock, British radar reports a large gathering over the Pas de Calais. The senior controller at Uxbridge immediately orders squadrons into the air. He instructs the sector controller at 11 Group's Biggin Hill sector station to scramble 92 Squadron and 72 Squadron Spitfires, shortly to be followed by 603 Squadron Spitfires from Hornchurch. Their job was to engage the top cover of Messerschmitt 109 fighters. This will leave the bombers temporarily unguarded and therefore vulnerable to attacks from pairs of Hurricane squadrons now also being scrambled. The Biggin Hill sector controller's voice crackles over the radio, providing clipped instructions to 92 Squadron, call sign Gannick, and 72 Squadron, call sign Tennis. Hello, Gannick leader, 200 plus coming over Red Queen. Vector 120, Angels 25. Watch out for snappers above. Hear me? Watch out for snappers above. He's telling them to go to Canterbury. Fly at 25,000 feet. There's an awful lot of Germans coming from that direction. And for Christ's sake, watch out for the Messerschmitt fighters. As they reach Canterbury, they start to scan the sky and search for the enemy. Have they been scrambled enough time? Do they have the advantage of height? Then 72 Squadron's commanding officer, Flight Lieutenant John Villa, spots the Germans. The Spitfires are 3,000 feet above the German fighters and 4,000 feet above the German bombers. They have the tactical advantage. He calls out, Tennis Squadron, tally-ho! This is heard by those on the ground at Biggin Hill and relayed to the bunker at Uxbridge. The lights turn to red, informing the senior controller and Churchill that the first engagements of the day are taking place 25,000 feet over Dungeness. The game is on. Villa orders his squadron into line astern and the Spitfires dive down on the enemy formations out of the sun. He reports, the Me-109, which I attacked, half rolled as I opened fire, and before he could dive away, he caught fire and exploded. I was then attacked by 5 other Me-109s. I did a steep turn to starboard and continued to turn until I outturned one Me-109, which was on my tail. I gave him 2 short bursts and he burst into flames. I then spun down to get away from more Me-109s, which dived down on me. The bombers are now attacked head-on by the Hurricanes of 253 and 501 squadrons from 11 Group's sector station at Kenley. Feldwebel William Raab reports, they came in fast, getting bigger and bigger. 4 Hurricanes scurried through the formation. Within seconds, they passed us. Then more black specks emerged from the bank of cloud in front, rapidly grew larger and flashed through our formation. Feldwebel Theodore Rem, in another bomber, also reports, the Hurricanes flashing close by, their thrusting attacks taking them right through our formation. Soon, more squadrons are sent into the air, with reinforcements from 10 Group and 12 Group. Squadron after squadron now line up to meet, attack and harry the enemy as they make their way to London. It is at this point that Churchill writes in his wartime memoir. Churchill says, presently, the red bob showed the majority of our squadrons were now engaged. I now asked, what other reserves have we? There are none, replied Air Vice Marshal Parr. Churchill goes on to write, the odds were great, our margin small, the stakes infinite. When they reach the capital, to their shock and horror, the Luftwaffe are met by 12 Groups Big Wing, a further 56 Spitfires and Hurricanes, led by their fearless and inspirational leader, Squadron Leader Douglas Bader, who, having lost both his legs in a pre-war flying accident at Reading, was now flying with artificial ones. Soon, the sky over London is filled with the contrails of British and German aircraft engaged in a frenzied battle of kill or be killed. Bader reports attacking a German bomber, opened fire at 100 yards in steep dive and saw large flash behind starboard motor as wing caught fire, then carried on and attacked another, but had to break away to avoid Spitfire. The sky was full of Spitfires and Hurricanes, queuing up and pushing each other out of the way to get at Dorniers, which for once were outnumbered. saw collision between Spitfire and Dornier, which wrecked both machines. It was the finest shambles I've been in, since for once we had position, height, and numbers. Enemy aircraft were a dirty-looking collection. Eventually, those German aircraft that are able to return to the safety of their Belgian and French airfields. Around 2:15 in the afternoon, British radar reports a large formation of enemy aircraft again over the Pas de Calais. It is even bigger than the morning raid. In the morning, 23 squadrons were scrambled. Now, 25 squadrons are sent into the air to engage the Luftwaffe. Again, squadron after squadron line up to meet, attack, and harry the German formations. Squadron leader George Denholm reports, I fired a short burst and dived through the formation. I saw the two Dorniers at which I had fired lagging behind the formation, emitting black smoke. I was then fired at, and flames started to come through my instrument panel, which was broken. So I bailed out. The two opposing forces continued to clash over many cubic miles of sky. Flight Lieutenant Raymond Duke Woolley reports, the last 3 attacks were carried out on different aircraft. On second attack, I observed pilot's cockpit enclosure of one Dornier collapse. The skirmishing between the Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe is fast, furious, and chaotic as enemy aircraft are attacked or are attacked. Flight Lieutenant Tadeusz Klopic's Hurricane is hit and he bails out. His parachute fails to open and he falls to his death. Pilot Officer Stanislav Lapka dives to attack a Dornier, getting in a long burst. But at this moment, his starboard machine gun panel blows up, causing a very big drag. His Hurricane is hit by return fire from the rear gun of the Dornier he is attacking. Lapka's cockpit is immediately filled with smoke, and he dives away. After some difficulty, he too bails out. But unlike Klopic, his parachute opens, and he lands safely with only a minor injury to his foot. The fighting continues as the raiders are chased back to the French and Belgian coast. When the final blocks are removed from the map, Winston and Clementine walk down from the gallery and stand in the plotting room. Churchill, grinning like a Cheshire cat, takes out the unlit cigar from his mouth. He looks around and he says, "Well done." He is then shown upstairs by Keith Park, and he tells Park that was satisfactory. But Park is unhappy. He wishes more bombers had been shot down. But the truth is that fighter command squadrons were able to intercept the enemy. The integrated air defense system did work when Britain needed it most. 2 days later, code breakers at Bletchley Park have broken the German Enigma code interceptor message reporting that equipment at German airfields in Belgium used to load planes with paratroopers and their equipment is about to be dismantled. This is seen as a clear sign that Operation Seelöwe, the intended invasion of the British Isles, has been indefinitely postponed. Had it all been worthwhile? Well, I'll tell you. Fighter Command loses 544 aircrew during the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe lose 2,600. But it means that Britain is not invaded. It will remain free to be used 4 years later as the springboard from which to launch the assault against Hitler's European fortress through Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings at Normandy. So, what does all of this mean? Well, when I stand in the underground bunker at Uxbridge and I look down at the actual map on which the Battle of Britain was fought and won, I see that in the summer of 1940, Britain was like a castle, surrounded by her moat, the English Channel. The integrated air defense system, which you've heard about, was the drawbridge, which could be raised to prevent the enemy from gaining entry. And the underground operations room at Uxbridge, the Battle of Britain bunker, was the gatehouse which controlled that drawbridge. And in the summer of 1940, it allowed the drawbridge to be raised and prevented the Germans from entering. Finally, I've discovered that I love writing and I love presenting. Enemy Sighted is the first in a trilogy, telling the fascinating wartime events through the lens of Fighter Command's 11 Group Operations Room, the Battle of Britain bunker at Uxbridge. I've started the next instalment, Enemy Engaged, which would take the reader beyond the Battle of Britain, through the Blitz on major towns and cities, through Fighter Command's offensive over occupied Europe in operations called rhubarbs, rodeos, ramrods, and circuses, and through to the Allied raid on Dieppe. My research so far has left me feeling decidedly excited. The third and final book in the trilogy will be titled Enemy Assailed, which will follow Fighter Command beyond Dieppe through more fighter sweeps over occupied France to the storming of Hitler's European fortress through the D-Day landings at Normandy, which all aerial operations were controlled from the underground bunker at Uxbridge. And finally, the fight against Hitler's vengeance weapons, the V-1 Doodlebugs and V-2 rockets. Again, much of the resistance to that controlled from the bunker at Uxbridge. So, Paul, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for listening. It's a fascinating story, one I believe that we should all hear, that we should all remember, so we all continue to honor the men who flew the fighter aircraft and the men and women who helped put them there. So thank you very much.
Well, I mean, if only you'd put a little bit more energy into that, Dilip, honestly, you know? I mean, talk about one-note flat presentation style. I jest, of course. Yeah, I mean, as Brad from OTD Military said, wow. And I think, you know, you're summing up of that story. It's the reminder that there's two ways of looking at World War II. There are times to have your analytical hat on, metaphorically speaking, when you're looking at the fact that perhaps the Luftwaffe wasn't quite the threat we thought it was, and maybe some of these battles weren't quite as close a run of thing as we think they are. Then the other times you have your emotional hat on, when you realize, as you've been explaining, there are those moments when it's all hands to the pump and there are aircraft flying all over Kent and London, and it is down to the actions of these individuals. It is down to this system there, and there are these knife edge moments where, if you were living through that moment, it would have absolutely seemed that you were on the brink of, you know, it goes one way, we win the war, we go the other way, we lose the war.
I think there's a couple of things there, Paul. Again, more in the book, obviously, but, you know, I share with readers the intelligence profile that was developed for the cabinet during 1939, 1940. And they were very certain that invasion would follow. So we have to put ourselves in the mind of people in those dark days. Also, there's a number of things. It was a very close run thing. Importantly, I think Britain had an excellent integrated air defense system. Remember, I said that Chamberlain had bought not peace, but he had bought time, and under Dowding's stewardship, everything was able to be lined up. Indeed, Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's leading aces and generals during the war, he comments that learning about Britain's integrated air defense system was a very bitter shock for them. He said we had nothing like it, and all we could do was continue to knock directly on this extremely well defense of Britain. So that's from the Germans themselves. I think two more things, really. One, I think it's always tougher when you're fighting on enemy territory. Remember, Fighter Command suffered this, as you see in the next book, with what Trenchard called leading forward into France, and Fighter Command's losses were quite significant. And I think the final point is, thank God for real effective leadership. Dowding, Park, and others were very effective empowering leaders. They did not micromanage, they did not interfere. They would sit back, reflect, and then give instructions for the following day. Then we just look at Hitler's interference and Göring's interference. Hitler saying stop attacking fighter stations, which was catastrophic for him. Goring, which I mentioned again in more detail, he loathed all sorts of technicalities. He didn't get radar at all, and then for him to call his fighter pilots cowards and now to fly alongside the bombers when they're over England and so lose all of their tactical advantage. So I think there are a number of factors, but definitely, and Britain was in a perilous state. And while she won the Battle of Britain, I have no doubt that Churchill's words, the British public would have fought stoically on the beaches and then in the fields and then in the towns and then the hills. But the German here, the German military and the Luftwaffe were all powerful. So,
no, thanks for that. And we'll do a couple of questions now. And the first one is kind of a bit of a downer, really, after the presentation. Then, because you talked about Dowding and Park being kind of the right guys there at the time there, but it's fair to say that their careers didn't necessarily continue on an upward trajectory. So without kind of spoiling too much what you can maybe talk about in future books there, Grant Dunn said, Big Wing, Park and Dowding being removed, will these be discussed later? So for those who don't know what happened to Dowding and Park, kind of to summarize what happened for them as the war goes on.
Sure. I mean, look, I think they were subject to a lot of politics. There was conflict. Certainly Dowding had to manage the conflict between his commanding officer for 11 Group at Uxbridge, Keith Parr, and Trafford Leigh-Mallory at 12 Group, which is where the Big Wing and Douglas Bader operated from. And it's true to say that Bader was an inspirational leader, and he did much to help the war effort, but he wanted to be more involved in the fighting. And Trafford Leigh-Mallory had or gave him his support. Now, the problem with the Big Wing, and as it's been shown in lots of accounts and research since, is on the September the 15th, Battle of Britain Day, the Big Wing worked on two key raids, the morning and the afternoon. But it's true to say that the majority of times the Big Wing had been deployed throughout the Battle of Britain, it wasn't as successful. Again, I say much more in the book about from Second World War figures that were available at the time of how long it took. Remember, it's all about time. And so when pairs of squadrons were scrambled in 11 Group, they didn't wait for each other and rendezvous over a particular location and then go up. It was felt it was much more important for them both to go as quickly as they could to the right altitude. And it was said that it's better than to have squadron beside you looking up at the enemy as you're climbing, to already have a squadron above you engaging the enemy as you're now making your way up. And the times, and again it's in the book, about how much longer it took to form up to 5 squadrons over somewhere before they made their way. Now, the Big Wing theory was that en masse you can knock out more aircraft, but problem is that would be after they'd achieved their objectives, which was to bomb 11 Group's precious airfields, or London itself, or the Supermarine Spitfire factory at Southampton, or Hurricane factory at Langley in Berks, or wherever really. So I think I'm certainly of the view from everything I've seen that had the Big Wing been employed during the Battle of Britain, then the interceptions wouldn't have taken place, or certainly not until after the Luftwaffe had bombed and disrupted 11 Group and also fighter production. So I think there's an awful lot of politics. Now, Keith Parr was moved to Malta then, and he was also then called the Defender of Malta. So
it came up in the sidebar, did it? Yeah, and we'll be talking about Malta at some point in the future. So yeah, I mean, but yeah, it's interesting that sometimes a hero at one point, one year's hero can be another year's villain, and vice versa. And certain people from World War II, like General Alexander, go in and out of favor, and Auchinleck and Montgomery, I guess, goes in and out of favor at various points. But it's right now talking about 1940 was important. A few more questions.
Just on Dowding, very quickly, Paul. Dowding. And again, speak much more in the book about his demeanor, his character. He was a very reflective individual. He wasn't showy, etc. And that's what you needed for somebody to bring together world's first integrated air defense system. You didn't want someone who was too much of an extrovert, etc. He would reflect, and importantly, he did what all good leaders do, which is surround themselves with good people.
Yeah.
Tell them what you want them to do. Let them get on and do it, and then just watch and make observations on the back of that.
That's a really good point, Dilip, because Dowding is the ringmaster of a system as opposed to a kind of a dominating leader. And that sometimes battles are won by someone actually making individual decisions as a commander. But Dowding, it's the faith is in the system. The faith is in the structure around and below him and all those people there. So it doesn't need a showy person. It needs a conductor rather than a lead singer, if that's a weird analogy there.
Just one quick thing on that, sorry, is Park. Now, Park would allow, again, it says more in the books, because Churchill's observations on 15 September, and he talks about the Air Vice Marshal walking behind his senior controller, and only at key points would he place his shoulder on the controller and just mutter a few words of support or advice, and then he'd back off. And Park himself, on many nights or evenings after a heavy day's fighting across southern England, would get into his own personal Hurricane at great risk to himself and fly to one of 11 group sector airfields and actually meet and talk with his pilots to, one, give support and morale, but also to understand what was actually happening.
Okay, thank you. Good question, I think. Well, I'll add some other detail to it. So Bruce Day is saying, hope to hear about how the chain home operators were selected. Because when we were talking in our pre-chat a few days ago, we were talking about, again, the system, that RDF, radar direction finding, is a system they have, but there's this human element. People have got to be skilled at it. It's like the operators of sonar on submarines. There's a gadget, but there's a person interpreting that gadget to get the best of it. So when the radar signals are coming in, how are these people trained? Is there a particular way that they were finding people with the right talent? Is it something you could be trained to do effectively, or was there kind of a natural ability there?
I think it's both, really, isn't it?
Right.
And definitely. And again, speak more in the book about special duties clerks who did all these things, and radar operators. But they had to manage complexity, fast time, keep their composure, but actually understand the mechanistic stuff in front of them. And again, it comes from the ladies, really. That they got to interpret the blips on their screens better and better as clearly they received more training, and then obviously in the heat of battle. Now, one of the things I mentioned in the book, because it was said by so many people, is that radar and interpreting and interrogating the radar signals was more an art than a science as far as the radar operators are controlled. It was a knack. And it's like when we're driving and the car in front of you is slowing down before the brake lights actually go on, etc. And so people got a sense, and they were very good. Interesting about radar. Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say that makes sense that there's like an instinct involved, isn't it? It's like the difference between a Formula One driver and the rest of us is that kind of thinking ahead aspect and because you broke down the time, the 20 minutes, it's not like you've got 10 minutes to kind of check with someone else and say, do you think that's that? And can we do this? And should we run it through the thing again? You've got to make these decisions kind of instinctively and immediately, because speed is absolutely essence. I'm imagining that interpretation is key, that swift interpretation.
Absolutely. So yesterday, I said I was at National Archives yesterday, and I was reading various reports, Air Ministry reports there, and they were talking in great detail as we move forward now to 1941 about the methodology and the actual process, how telling would be done for the plotters and tellers in the operations rooms, etc. And that had to be succinct. It had to be in the same format, and it had to be done speedily and accurately and precisely. So everything was really, really refined, but it still needed these people to use their intuition. And I describe them in the book as artisans. They were specialists in what they did.
Okay, thanks. Another one, and it's about the women there. It was an early question, but I saved it to ask at the right time. So Bill Kemp is saying, when were the females integrated into the chain home from the beginning, or did it take a while to kind of phase? Because you said at the beginning there was this idea that women wouldn't be able to, operate the table, blah blah blah. So was it kind of inclusive from the beginning, or was there a sort of a transition period?
it was a transition, and it always remained a transition. There was a requirement for a certain number of men to be there, as well as a certain number of females, because there's a social lack of wisdom at time thought that they would collapse under pressure. And as I make great effort pains to say, that nothing could be further from truth there. Now, importantly, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force was created as war was about to be declared, or at the same time. So it was a new concept, and it was formalizing this availability, really. And then as the war progressed, women took on more and more roles, and importantly, in 1941, 1942, as more men were being required to fight in the front line, because women weren't still legally allowed to do that, but also they had proven their worth as well. So women started to be commissioned for officer duties within the network of sector operations rooms, group operations rooms, and indeed fighter command in the filter room as well.
Okay, thank you. And about the bunker, Philip was asking earlier, he would like a clarification on the numbers of personnel in the bunker about the shift, because there's the person, there's also the sentries guarding the gates and all that kind of stuff. So kind of just break it down for us. So how many people would be there at any one time?
Okay, so it's not 14. So Philip, there were 4 shifts, or they call themselves watches, and each one would have 70 people. Yep. Theoretically, they would work 8 hours, 3 of them, and the 4th one would theoretically be off that day. Of course, it was never quite as clear as that. And I say 80% of them would be ladies, predominantly from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. An interesting thing about those people in the shift, 3 of those at Uxbridge, every shift, would be members of the GPO, what we know as the General Post Office. And we know at that time, certainly, and until quite recently, the GPO would manage all telecommunications in the country. And so amongst each of those shifts at Uxbridge, there would be 3 GPO engineers, 2 engineers, and 1 manager. And then each of the sector stations, there would be a GPO engineer 24 hours a day. And so in the middle of air raids, when sector stations and operations rooms were hit, the GPO engineer at, say, Biggin Hill, for example, would be busy reconnecting all the cables and wires so that communication between Uxbridge and Biggin Hill, for example, would continue. I mentioned in the book about all the plan B and C if communication failed, but also mentioned in the book what are those people in the shift, 3 of those Uxbridge. Check it out. Okay. What Park also said is that without communication, all he commanded was his desk at Uxbridge. But we know that with communications, he was commanding the best in the world.
Right, thank you. Another quick question. How long will it take to build one of those towers? And more importantly, the associated instrumentation behind it?
We're talking about the radar towers, yes? Yeah, sure. They took many months. And again, much more detail in the book. And it's fair to say the radar chapter is one of the biggest, because actually radar was the game changer. Radar was the thing that made all the difference. I mentioned about the sound mirrors before, the concrete mirrors, which had been developed during the First World War. The thing is, by the time they would pick anything up, and it's a big question whether they would pick it up, the speed of aircraft, they were already over Britain. So anyway, radar was a big thing, etc. They were called Home Office experimental stations, Air Ministry experimental stations, to try to confuse the Germans. And then you'll see in the book, there were several types, type 1, 2, 3, etc. And they were continuously modified as war went on. But importantly, whilst the Germans thought they weren't making much of an impact on them, they were actually, but they were actually very difficult for the German bombers to hit because of the lattice type framework. Bombs could just go through and make a bit of damage, etc. So, but they were constantly refined, and there's much more in the book. Certainly at a technical level, some really interesting thing. Interesting thing also about radar, and we were saying before, Paul, we're passionate about this, so we research, we learn a lot, but you know what? We learn stuff all the time. I didn't know, and now I mentioned in the book, how are these radar stations calibrated? because, and I mentioned in the war from accounts, all the occasions when actually they were reading incorrectly. So maybe they weren't giving height, or they were giving a wrong height. And remember, if you send your fighters the wrong height, the German aircraft won't even be seen or intercepted, etc. So the British couldn't use fighters, one, because fighters were in short supply, and also fighters couldn't stay in one space. They had to sort of go around. Balloons didn't work because even though they're tethered to ships, they would keep moving around, etc. So, and I mentioned in the book about the use of gyroscopes, the half helicopter, half plane jobs, really. And I talk in detail about how they were used, because they could hover over a particular point over the English Channel whilst the radar stations would calibrate what they were receiving, etc. And importantly, those were actually being flown and used as the Battle of Britain was being fought. But as far as I know, the Germans never shot any down. I mean, they would have been really vulnerable, wouldn't they? Just hovering over a part of the English Channel. But there was so much to it. But again, it was all about interpretation, because when the filter room at Bentley Priory received the reading from the radar station, they had to rapidly determine, is this because of a weather phenomenon? Is this a flock of birds? Is it something wrong with instruments? Are they aircraft? If so, whose aircraft? We're not sure. X raid, they're hostile, H raid, or F for friendly. All of that's done and sent to the senior controller at Uxbridge within 4 minutes. That's pretty good stuff.
Yeah. Trent Telenko, who I told you in advance will be one of the radar experts, because he's always talking about the Southern Pacific. He's adding another point there, which you may or may not know. His radar towers were very vulnerable to fragmentation bombs. This was a Section 22 trick in the Pacific. The Germans simply didn't have the combat experience of enemy radars at the time to know that. So there's a direct kind of connection that later in the war, they worked out that there is a way of getting radar towers, and it's by using fragmentation bombs. So that's Trent's bit of detail there, which is nice.
Trent, you're absolutely right. And, this saying about necessity is the mother of all invention. And we know in conflict, in war, then you have to learn fast, otherwise you die. And so that's a really good example. And had the Germans known that, then perhaps, things could have been a bit different.
And then one last question from the viewer, then I've got one from me. So another one, which is really, because we're talking about this being the first system. He said, Bill says, what country was the next to develop something of the equivalent of the chain home, and how long did it take? So there we are, one for you. I hadn't thought about that as a question. Who was second? No one remembers who's second in history, but who was second?
Unfortunately, really, it's the Germans, isn't it?
Yeah,
because
I knew you were going to say that.
They had radar, and Goring has is on record against in the book that we know about the radar towers, etc. But they felt that the British system was much inferior than theirs, but they failed to understand how it was part of the integrated air defense system. They thought it was actually a restraint, and that fighters were controlled by these radar masks, etc. But actually, therefore, they had to stay within a certain area, which wasn't the case at all. But they used, unfortunately, radar to great effect when Bomber Command and then Fighter Command went across the channel. So that's an awful shame, really. And then others picked it up as well.
Thank you for that. My last question is really, you're coming from the world of policing and detective work, where despite what TV shows tell us, it's actually quite painstaking, and building cases and building evidence is very time consuming, and it's double checking and triple checking and things like that. What amazed me when I was at the bunker in September, and from your presentation, is just how quickly this all has to work. The technology is one thing, but the speed it works at, the potential of human error at any one point. I know there's some sort of fail-safes in that maybe the aircraft are flying over 3 or 4 different observer corps positions, so there's chances to, if they say that the enemy are at 12,000 feet, if one says it's 10,000 feet, the other 3 all say it's 12,000 feet, so maybe you can correct some potential human error. But the moving of those with the sticks and the poles and the positions on the map there, that if you get something wrong at that moment there and someone doesn't notice it, how I mean, it's a trite question, but I'm going to ask, how impressed are you at just the ability of these people there to work under such pressure and so many hours and not really make many mistakes?
I am in awe of them. I say I'll be going there to do several tours tomorrow, and I am passionate. And I'm generally respectful because what I say. So again, necessity is the mother of invention,
Yeah.
and better sort of procedures, if you like. And so Park and Andy, but Park would issue his instructions again. Much more about it in the book. Being a reflective leader, what didn't work. For example. He realized that bombers were getting through. And part of the reason was Spitfires and Hurricanes were being sent. The operations room at Uxbridge was told Big and Hillsay to send them to a particular altitude. The sector controller, and Park being a bit sarcastic in his better knowledge, etc., would send them several thousand feet higher because if you have height, you have the advantage. And then the formation leader think, I'll go a bit higher than that. And so they were ultimately maybe 5, 6, 7,000 feet higher. They never even saw the bombers. So an instruction went out, etc. Just going back about the ladies, I actually mentioned this in my presentations. When you look at the big map, each of the little squares is 10 square kilometers.
Yep.
Okay. So if the teller, if she mishears the information on her telephone headset or reads on the teleprinters which are around the table, and she relays the wrong information, our senior controller looking down from the gallery is now looking at flawed information on his computer screen, and therefore he will make flawed decisions. If her partner, the plotter, mishears what she's been told or puts the wrong information on those wooden blocks or puts the wooden block on the wrong square, then for any of those reasons, interception may not take place or it may not be effective. The Battle of Britain would be lost. Invasion follows. Britain is in a perilous state. So, this was life and death stuff. And like policing, where I know you're acting and you're making really life and death decisions with imprecise, incomplete information coming in thick and fast, this was that on a much bigger scale. And they did themselves and all of us proud.
And on that note, it's a perfect way to finish off tonight. And people have been screaming in the sidebar about where have I been hiding you? Why have you not been on the channel before? When are you going to bring him back? History presented like a Shakespearean, blah, 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 Churchill impression. So I will invite you back. I'd said to you before, I was going to invite you back before you'd even done your performance, but you're absolutely going to get an invite back. So I remind people again, yes, they can contact you to get signed books or they can buy them from their favorite bookseller. And this is part of a trilogy. So we can either have you back on when the second one is out or at some point in the future. But you must be exhausted. You're going to have an adult beverage to finish the evening.
But when you're so happy about something, so passionate, it's a pleasure. So absolutely, contact me if you want the book. But also, I'm very happy, and I have been asked to do a number of presentations to different groups. So if anyone is interested, then again, get onto my website and let me know, and we'll take it from there. But it's a pleasure, and thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you everyone for taking the time to listen.
Well, there we are. So, folks, I will see you on Monday. I've got weekend off. It's been absolutely fantastic today. Fantastic week, rounding off a fantastic week. Myths coming your way next week. So I will see you all again there. Meanwhile, it is me, Paul Woodadge, saying thank you very much. And we'll see you all next week. Cheers. Bye.